This episode is sponsored by Origami Risk, an award-winning, adaptable, cloud-based platform that can help you and your business manage all aspects of resilience, such as risk, safety, insurance, and even the management of business continuity and disaster recovery plans. Because Origami's single platform connects all of these functions, it provides a unified view of risk, leading you to better decision making, thus better business resilience. To help you boost your business's resilience, Origami Risk has put together a collection of free ebooks and videos exclusively for the RESILIENCEPOD family. To get access, visit origamirisk.com/resilience. Enjoy the episode. Welcome back to the Resilience Pod, the podcast helping you become resilient in our world full of disruptions. My name is Reena Singh and I'll be your host. Today we are talking about vulnerability and resilience. Quite an interesting topic with my next guest who brings a whole wealth of experience over 25 years focusing on issues management, crisis management, leadership, communication, and executive preparedness. Wow. So guys, there's no one better to talk about vulnerability and resilience than Rod Cartwright. Hi Rod, how are you doing? Welcome.
Reena, how are you? Great to be on.
Yeah, great. No, I'm really well, thanks. And guys, if you're listening, we are filming this in the summer and Rod has a Christmas tree in the background. So I want to know a little bit more about this before we get into the resilience and vulnerability topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically an act of defiance as we weren't able to spend Christmas with family and friends. So we took a family decision. We're damn well going to keep the thing up until we're able to do that. So we may do Christmas in June, or we might just keep it up the whole year. And it's a great icebreaker.
It is. Love it. So guys, if you are listening and you want to have a look at why Rod has got a Christmas tree and what it looks like, then head over to our YouTube channel and have a look. Right. Anyway, that aside, Rod, really excited to get deeper into this conversation about vulnerability and resilience because this is something really different. And when I talk about vulnerability and resilience as a topic, I'm really talking about the crisis and reputation side. And the first question I have for you really is, in our resilience industry, when we are looking at this crisis and reputation side, our leaders are the forefront of these incidents, right? Often they get it so wrong because we as individuals, we expect them to be perfect in the way they deliver it. Why is that?
Well, the thing is, I'm not sure we expect them to be perfect. Okay. I think two things happen. One is that they feel a pressure to be perfect. They feel a pressure not to make mistakes, as if they were sort of, gods among men, that they were immortal, but the reality is that they're not. So I think there's a sort of self-imposed pressure to be the corporate man or woman in front of camera. I think there's a second thing, which from my profession, which is strategic communications and PR, I remember being at a conference where I was speaking in Johannesburg, and someone from the South African government said, it was a session on leadership communication. And in the Q&A, she said, do you think that we are partly to blame as communicators for why leaders are so badly viewed? Because we're wired to try and make them look as perfect as possible when they're not perfect, inevitably. So if you paint someone as perfect, they will always fall short. So I think there's this self-imposed pressure, but there's also the pressure of advisors to be perfect when that simply isn't a human reality.
Wow, that's really interesting. Observation and a question you've posed back to us there is actually, why are we trying to be perfect in that sense? And guys, if you're listening or watching, have you ever felt this way? Are you a leader that's watching and you felt, oh gosh, I'm the face of this incident and I've got to really be that perfect person, and why, which leads me into that. My next question for you is then, how can imperfection and vulnerability ultimately build greater trust and connection? Because I guess if you do that, you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very human thing that goes on in a crisis is that, and we'll come on to it in a minute. I talk about operationalizing empathy.
Yeah.
And there was a piece of research that when I was at a previous agency, we did an annual global study looking at public perceptions of effective leadership on the one hand and effective communication on the other. And one year we asked, what behaviors do people look for from a leader in a crisis? And it was fascinating because the least important relatively, and I stress that, was showing empathy and communicating openly. And we were like, data guys, you've got all this wrong. This is crazy. Empathy is at the top. And they said, look at the top two attributes. And it was having a clear plan of action and identifying the nature of the problem. And the scale sort of fell away. And we realized that in a crisis, you want two things from a leader. You want the question answered, are they human and do they care, which is the empathy piece. And once they've ticked that box, your next question is, and now what are they going to do about it? So I think that the empathy piece in and of itself isn't the key. It's empathy as the basis for action. I think the other point is that when something tragic has happened, when there's been injury or loss of life, we don't want leaders to look like corporate automatons. We don't want them to look like machines delivering a corporate message. There's a great thing that a colleague does when she's training on crisis, which is she gets the trainees to read out their holding statement to another trainee as if it were a friend. And you suddenly realize that it's the humanity and the vulnerability and the honest, open admission that something has gone wrong, as opposed to this terrible corporate speak that we tend to default to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And almost that corporate speak seems really fake and insensitive, doesn't it? Especially when you're like reading what is perceived to be reading off a script. And that I like what you say about that humanity, the human side of it, which I feel we probably haven't mastered as much yet. When you see things on the news and it's kind of like, well, actually don't hide those emotions and hide those vulnerabilities. But ultimately, I feel personally that if something happened and you were the face of the incident and you showed some of your imperfections, your vulnerability, I'd probably resonate with you more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think two other observations, one sort of observation, one an anecdote, is that one of the issues I often find, and some of my best friends are lawyers, just to be clear, but the role of legal in crises, where there's such a neurosis of saying anything that represents a legal hostage to fortune, that represents liability, and you end up sometimes being in this tussle where legal are trying to take the humanity out of the language that you're using for fear of liability. And my argument is always, you see it again and again, the word sorry, the simple human word sorry, as we would say if we bumped into someone in the street, that's what you expect. And this fear of legal liability, which for me is always secondary to the reputational liability that you run if you don't show that vulnerability and humanity. I saw this, one of the crises I worked on, you may remember in 2014 that Malaysia Airlines lost a plane, flight MH370. And so much of what we were doing in the absence of any information whatsoever was simply showing that care for the next of kin and that human touch that the people running the airline, yes, they were chief executives and chairmen, but they were also fathers and brothers and sisters and cousins. And it's bringing through that humanity, not as some artificial PR technique, but simply because that's what they were and that's how they needed to come across.
So insightful. And I want to bring this back to our audience. If you guys are listening or watching, what do you think about this? Have you experienced this? Are you a leader that this is your job, you're actually the face of the organization? How have you felt? Have you said sorry? And the bit I want to go back to the bit where you say saying sorry, it's that legal thing is really interesting, and I feel like we could do a whole different blog podcast on this.
We could.
Yeah, but it's that perception of, if you say you're sorry, you've admitted liability. And obviously that's a different section, but it's really insightful that you've said that, because I'm going away thinking, actually, maybe that's not the case. Just actually showing that empathy is good enough.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I often, and it feels like a sort of semantic, pedantic point, but I've had arguments with lawyers again and again that showing sorrow that something has happened is very different from admitting responsibility for having caused it. And saying sorry, I mean, you can argue the toss on the semantics of it, but you're going to have liability whether or not you say sorry. The liability exists. So again, we're going off down a little legal cul-de-sac, but it is so fundamental. Showing sorrow that something has happened. That is, for me, I was working on a crisis recently, and it was very straightforward, is to say, I often talk about the 3 A's, which is acknowledge something has happened, apologize that it has happened, and then act.
Yeah.
And I think that those 3 A's can stand you in really good stead, because again, unless you're so scared of pretending that something hasn't happened and that you were in no way involved, people just smell a rat. So I think that the 3 A's and sorry are a very good way to go.
Love that. And we Brits have no problem saying sorry about every little thing. Right? If you bump into someone in the supermarket, say, hey,
Indeed.
It's one of those things. And if you are listening from a different country, let me know your thoughts too. Now, moving on from that, it's really interesting. You mentioned earlier about operationalizing empathy. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that means and what that entails?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, that was based on a sort of research insight, but that, like any great insight, resonated so strongly. I mean, it just sort of hit me between the eyes that it's not that empathy is unimportant, it has to be matched by action. So I think if you look at the great crisis responses, it's the wrong phrase, but 1-2 punch of the humility, the humanity, the vulnerability, and the apology, followed up by, now here's what we're going to do about it. And as I said earlier, it's working both in tandem, because I think the problem is that empathy without action risks looking simply like hollow, warm words.
Right, yeah.
Action without empathy runs the risk of looking very much like you've taken it from a template. You're doing what the corporation would be expected to do. So it's as with much in life, it's very yin and yang.
Wow, those are some really insightful points you've given there, Rod. And to make it more practical, so for our listeners, then from an organizational level and a human level, like, what approach should we be taking to bear all this in mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's something I developed at my last agency, which I called the human imperative, which is that if you think about it, if you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sorry to get bookish on you, but it's a very practical point, the realization that the brands that really cut through are those who connect with us on a human level in terms of our human needs, our human wants, and our human values and beliefs, not just in how they think, but in how they think, how they speak, how they act, crucially, and how they look. There's this phrase in comms called the say-do gap, which is the gap between what you say or claim, the expectations that creates, and then your ability to meet those expectations in your actions. And the bigger the gap between the claim and the reality, which brings us full circle back to where we started. If you claim perfection and you deliver imperfection, you've created that gap. So it's partly that thing of reconnecting with human values and beliefs first and foremost, but doing so in a way that aligns your words and your actions. And I think if you take 1 or 2 great examples, Volkswagen and the emission testing scandal, Volkswagen, the people's car. Well, that's a great claim, unless it turns out that you're systematically fixing emissions tests. And a little known story, they were at the same time testing emissions on live monkeys in garages. I can't think of a
Wow.
more vivid say-do gap between the people's car and the underlying corporate behaviors. And if you look at the billions that they've incurred in illegal class actions, leaving to one side their whole reputational liability. So it's a great example.
Wow. Do you have another example you could share that this has been done positively, just so we as the listeners or viewers can just really hone it in and really understand a bit deeper? Because for some of us, this is probably a completely new thing.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that, to be clear, is not an example of doing it well. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
great example of creating the biggest possible say-do gap. I think another one is a great one is the Fearless Girl statue in New York on Wall Street, which I'm sure you're familiar with, dreamt up by an ad agency for a company called State Street Global Advisors, won every award at the Cannes Creative Awards, lauded to the heavens for being an amazing organization focused on diversity and inclusion, until it was discovered that they were busy settling out of court with a series of senior female executives and executives of color for a massive pay discrimination case. So, again, a prime example of a claim through the Fearless Girl, when in reality, you have behind the scenes the direct opposite in your behavior of what you were claiming. So another example of how not to do it. In terms of how to do it, I mean, I think the one from the last year that really stood out is Airbnb last May found themselves in a position where, because of the pandemic, they had to make 25% of their staff redundant. And Brian Chesky, the CEO, wrote this amazing, I think, 5-page letter to employees with minute detail on the business background, the rationale, how it was going to work. There was a huge package of support. But what I loved is that he finished his letter, and I'm just going to quickly find that in my notes because it's just so powerful. He talked very openly about what was going on. And then at the end, he said, our brand has always been about more than just making money. At the core of our brand is travel, and that the core of travel is love. And again, out of context, it might seem a little bit cheesy, but it was a wonderful example of vulnerability, the human personal touch. I think another one finally is Marriott Hotels found they had to do the same thing. The CEO, Aaron Sorensen, who just undergone cancer treatment, did this amazing video talking about the pain of redundancy, and he had a little tear. Could people say, oh, he should be standing up as a leader? It went down incredibly well because there was that simple vulnerability at a human level. So another powerful example, juxtapose Joe Biden and Donald Trump, we could go on.
I just think that's really fascinating, and it's made me rethink some of the possibly the misconceptions I've had for looking at a leader and thinking, oh, they need to be perfect. But actually, I would find it more relatable if I was on the receiving end of that. And I think I want to know what you guys think. If you felt that way, or if you've always been like, yes, vulnerability and resilience go hand in hand. It's obvious, but actually, it wasn't obvious for me until we're doing this and getting more insights from you, Rod, with your wealth of experience. Now, do you feel that it's almost counterintuitive from a textbook kind of position where, over the years, you've got like over 25 years of experience doing this kind of reputation crisis comms? Have we always done it like that, or has it just changed recently where we're being a bit more vulnerable, leading to resilience?
What a really good question. I mean, if the textbook says we shouldn't be vulnerable, then I'd say buy a new textbook. Yeah. But I think that there has been an increasing trend within leadership and management away from pure functional IQ into balancing that with EQ and emotional intelligence. And you're seeing a lot of debates in the recruitment and HR industry about looking for that balance of IQ and EQ. I think societally, we've been more comfortable talking about issues around mental health, and therefore the notion, it's okay not to be okay. Therefore, it's okay not to be perfect as a leader. So I think there is some, again, we could do a whole other episode on this, but there are a whole load of social and societal trends that I think have militated towards this. The one thing that you just sparked was the research I mentioned. One year we looked at gender and leadership, and we basically said, what are the key attributes you look for in a leader? And then when we said, are male or female leaders demonstrating those more effectively, female leaders won hands down.
Wow.
And we coined this phrase at the time: the future of leadership communication is more feminine. That's not to say that all female leaders are amazing and all male leaders are rubbish. It's just, regardless of whether you're male or female, you need to look at the attributes that female leaders are demonstrating more effectively. And that is not merely admitting mistakes, which was right up there every year. It's also taking tough decisions. And if you look at, the record under COVID of male and female leaders, there is a direct correlation between countries led by women and countries led by men. And again, we could talk about this for hours, but the data correlate. Can I establish causation? I don't know, but there is very definitely correlation there, and vulnerability comes into that.
Wow, I think that's spot on. And actually, you're the second guest or third guest that's actually said this about COVID related. And I know we all want to talk about that, but about that. So that's really interesting that actually a lot of us in the industry are picking up on this observation. So thank you so much for your insights. Is there any last parting words you would like to share with the audience before we close off?
No, I just think, sorry, yes is the answer to your question. I just think that as a leader, whether in a crisis situation or not, you are not perfect, because none of us are. At least you maybe, I'm certainly not.
Yeah, I know, I agree.
And therefore, starting with your own imperfection, which, by the way, is not weakness. I think there's, I wrote an article last year called The Power of Vulnerability and the Strength of Imperfection. There is power and strength in vulnerability. It's not weakness. So almost relish your imperfection and make a virtue of it. Don't view it as a birch twig with which to whip yourself.
Fantastic. Absolutely love that, Rod, and everything you have said. I personally definitely feel that vulnerability is linked to resilience. So high five to that. And guys, what do you think? Is vulnerability linked to resilience? Let me know. Comment on this video and share your thoughts, because we're all for that. So get involved in the conversation. Right. So Rod, thank you once again for being with us on the Resilience Pod. It's been a great pleasure.
It was an absolute pleasure and a great conversation. I wish we'd had 2 hours.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much. And guys, thank you so much for tuning in today, whether you were listening to us or watching. I am truly grateful. If you like this, then comment, share wide to your network, and don't forget to subscribe to the resiliencepod.com website and join us all over social media. So that's it from me, your host Reena Singh, with our guest Rod Cartwright. Until next time, keep on investing in your resilience.